copying, influence, homage, plagiarism, the stealing of ideas in art. We know it when we see it. Or do we? Something is seemingly cut and dry as one person stealing another's work opens up a Pandora's box of questions around art, creativity, and originality. Questions that, when not answered fully, threaten the very artists they advocate for. Why do we hate one form of stealing and love others? Why does personal sentiment matter more than legality? And what does this all have to do with memes? This is a video about why all the best art is actually stolen. Sometime around 2017, I was an art student in college, and one of my good friends who had just begun to see a bit of online recognition, he woke up one day to see a popular skate brand had released a deck with his painting on it. Yeah, a brand you've probably heard of, except it wasn't exactly his painting. He and I and our peers, we were all part of this little niche, all working with similar aesthetics, and someone who worked for the skate fashion company, someone who 100% followed my buddy on Instagram, saw his design, replicated it almost exactly, and shipped it off as that week's new skate deck. Now, for privacy reasons, I'm not showing you the exact imagery here, but the point of this story is this. It might sound harsh, but getting your art stolen, if it's never happened to you, you might just not be that good yet. This video will revolve around the recent plagiarism by Bungie Studios of graphic designer Anti-Real's work for the upcoming game Marathon, which was a hot-button topic like several weeks ago, so a bit of an audience warning here. If you're here to hear about how the game is dead on arrival as a result of this, if you're here to dogpile on the studio, this video is not going to be for you. If you want to hear about how the issue was overblown, how it's been sorted out, and how we should all just move on now for the good of the game, this video's not for you either. Because this has happened before, and it will happen again. My goal here is not to just react to this one event, but analyze how and why we got here. Hopefully to bring some clarity, not just to this example, but any and all like it for years to come. But to get there, we need to go back a few years first. Like, quite a few years. Albrecht Dürer, born 1471, Nuremberg, one of the most well-renowned painters and printmakers of his time. His prints were highly sought after all across Europe, signed with his signature AD monogram. Sometime in the early 1500s, Venetian artist Marcantonio Raimondi is accused by Dürer of selling counterfeit copies of his prints, skillfully executed copies, all the way down to his iconic signature. Long story short, the courts demand Raimondi to cease producing and selling works presented with the name or iconic AD monogram signature of Albrecht Dürer. Essentially, other than that, he was free to make and sell otherwise exact copies of Dürer's prints. I relay to you this story for one reason. The courts may have decided one thing, but who do you believe was in the right here? This classic Renaissance-era litigation was a watershed moment for art ownership, at a time when artists like Dürer were actively changing the place that art had in society. With the advent of the printing press, art was no longer just commissioned by patrons, it was sold. Copies of it were sold. And artists, as a result, began to shift from craftspeople to business people, selling their art, their brand. Copying, a process so fundamental to art making, it's perhaps the essence of art itself. Hell, the Renaissance masters religiously copying antiquities unearthed in Rome skyrocketed technical skill in European art by about 1,000 years. But how one copies and why, that defines something far more important than legality. It defines if we perceive art as good. The way that you steal matters, but actually, to be more specific, your intention when stealing. There are many modes. Homage, most people understand copying someone's ideas in order to show love and respect for them. This sniper scene in Call of Duty World at War, for example, was a direct homage to the legendary timed shot scene from Enemy at the Gates, paying respect, homage, through imitation. Other modes of artistic stealing can be harder to define, such as appropriation, anything from ready-made to photo montage, collage, or the combines of artists like Robert Rauschenberg. The artist does not create the imagery outright, but changes its context in order to imbue it with new meaning. Then there's pastiche, the copying of many disparate, contrasting sources, creating new, unique flavors when combined. Look at how both Star Wars and 1986's Aliens use World War II and Vietnam War imagery and objects. Different combinations of shared ingredients means drastically different resulting tones, messages, and, of course, aesthetics. We need to understand how normal the stealing of ideas is in art. who you're copying from and why, what the copied thing was saying, what it was taking influence from. The better an artist understands this lineage, this never-ending cycle of art as reflection, the better their art will be, the better it will be received. And while it's normal, fundamental even, it can still go very, very wrong. And not because someone stole. In order to truly understand a case where this happened, we need to dissect where its ideas came from. So, I'm an art guy, as should be clear, who of course loves games, but I am not good with technology, or I never was. Which is why Boot.dev was such a perfect tool for me, and they are once again the sponsor of today's video. Now, I love having Boot.dev on here because it is legitimately a service catered towards people like me. It's a full track of back-end development coding courses, but all presented through the lens of an RPG. Essentially, the philosophy is that when you actually feel engaged and rewarded for learning, the better you learn. I finally gave learning Python a shot, and while it was definitely tricky for me at first, the courses really present everything from the bottom up in a way that lets you feel like you can solve problems on your own. And while the experience is gamified with power-ups and XP, etc., the methods you'll be using are specifically meant to mirror real-world skills that you would need on the job. And if you follow the track of courses here, all of which you can just try out for free, by the way, you'll be set up with everything that you need for an actual career in this space. So if you've ever been hesitant about getting into this stuff, give it a shot and sign up using the code Riloe for 25% off your entire order. I always love having Boot.dev on here, and thank you so much again to them for supporting the channel today. Marathon. Where was it getting its ideas? Prior to Marathon's playable alpha, I was personally lucky enough to speak pretty extensively one-on-one with members of Bungie's art team, and I think it's fundamentally important that people hear from a primary source prior to any of this controversy on the development of Marathon's art direction and graphic style, rather than conjecturing on it through observation. Because Marathon, in the beginning, it was very different. The path to defining a new take on the universe was freeform. The original Marathon games themselves, while certainly having an art style, had never been visually realized with modern sensibilities or fidelity. Craig Mullins' now iconic fan art was one interpretation, retroactively included canonically, but these were one artist's impression of the game's extremely simple visual notes. They were inspired by the game's existing visuals, not the other way around. From very early on, the goal with new Marathon was to visually reimagine the beloved, yet 30+ years dormant IP by staying loyal to its notes and tone in a way which also stood on its own as a fresh, specific flavor of modern sci-fi. That of a light-hearted, bright, and expressive presentation covering this dark Cronenberg horror underlayer, a feeling of cosmic mystery, if you will, behind veils of medical plastic. And to do this, the first step was not visual, it was concept. Futurism, with a focus on nature, post-humanism, and soft robotics. Designers like Neri Oxman, researching biologically grown architecture, clothing, and everyday objects, and the surreal, biologically motivated design of Joris Putniers were some of the core inspirations for Marathon's idea of these silkworm printed shell bodies and spaces. Documentary photography was a big influence. Daniel Everett's deconstruction, the natural, almost breathing beauty of incomplete human spaces. Aerial photography, and its ability to reveal these PCB-like patterns and color schemes in structures viewed at a macro scale. The extremely abstract city planning architecture of Brian Cantley, meshing recognizable shapes, intentional patterns, symmetry, and balance, deconstructed and truncated typography. Strange, uncomfortable medical shapes in pristine environments from Pakui Hardware, the audiovisual experiences of Robert Henke and Chris Cunningham especially, huge inspirations tonally. The 1990s biomechanical techno-surrealism and optimistic futurism with this uncomfortable, sort of gross, wet analog grit lurking beneath the surface. All these conceptual and aesthetic influences were collected early on, and the original tested visual style of Marathon was very, very different from what audiences have seen today. Obviously, I can't show you what I mean here, but it was photorealistic with a sort of embellished 90s anime sci-fi treatment, rivets and wires, hard and soft paneling, tons of detail, many varying and clashing textures, and a deep contrast between light and shadow, very reminiscent of Joe Cross's earlier personal work, by the way. And while quite cool in its own right, it was noticeably derivative of its source material, and much closer to both prior Bungie projects' aesthetics and popular ArtStation, sort of hard surface sci-fi, if you will. I do really hope that the team is able to show examples of this super early high-fidelity art style someday. As a direct relation of original Marathon to the modern day, it was perhaps successful, but against all media, a new flavor of sci-fi, it was not. See, the goal with Marathon was multifaceted. To create a new face of science fiction, sure, but also to create something both of its time and timeless. A visual language which would not age simply because its method of execution had. Creating something timeless that feels new, which is innovative and esoteric yet also attractive to the mainstream. Many have tried, a select few have succeeded. Firstly, and most importantly, Alberto Miyago's work on Into the Spider-Verse. Miyago's animation style is instantly recognizable, and his goal, in his words, was to disrupt an established repetitive look that animation establishment had smashed in our faces for decades. And while it may have been too scary for his bosses at the time, seeing that he was fired from the Spider-Verse project before it ever entered production, the waves his work had on the world of animation as a result can still be felt to this day. And this was the goal of Marathon's art direction. This was where graphic realism was really born. A focus on realistic proportion and industrial design, grounded shapes and settings with a stylized treatment on top. Art world influences came in like Hiroshi Yoshida, grounded spaces and landscapes visually simplified into limited palettes and flat textures, the mid-20th century paintings of Bernie Fuchs, photorealism through this graphic lens, striking light and living, breathing compositions smashed into massively contrasting, simplified, and flat color. The era of adult animation, if you will. Japanese works in the 1980s through 90s, Masamune Shirow being the ever-influential god of stylized realism with Ghost in the Shell, Intron Depot, and Appleseed, of course. Pat Labor, Venus Wars, Akira, Satoshi Kon, and Mamoto Oshii. All that late 20th century grounded yet expressionist science fiction bumped up against the free-form natural shapes and biological mannerism of artists like Katsuya Terada and Takayuki Takeya. Games which brought visual and graphic design to the forefront, which went beyond realism or graphic fidelity into something stylized and timeless. Mirror's Edge, with its gorgeous lighting and stark color against flat, minimalist environments, and Breath of the Wild, with its limited color and texture palette delectably gorgeous in all of its matte simplicity. The tenets of graphic realism arose. Form, function, silhouette. Shapes were simplified, graphic elements expressing implied functionality. The feeling of that playful yet utilitarian design of teenage engineering and IKEA, minimalism and modularity, prefabricated puzzle pieces with increasingly strict design language, avoiding the tiresome sci-fi design tropes. No triangles, limited 45-degree angles, rounded edges but geometric shapes first. Contrast and color is key, but the palette is limited. 2 texture treatments, matte or gloss, nothing else. Typography on top of biomedical futurism, sports and fashion influences such as Craig Green's interest in unexpected texture, material, and color treatment against warped but familiar silhouettes. Nike ISPA's interest in playfully utilitarian garments with recycled, sustainable materials. Make Haste Corp, POC Cycling, the Tour de France, Formula One, and MotoGP, where visual elements are designed around ultra-visible and identifiable functionality. American football uniforms, where unified brand identity is iterated upon constantly with new color schemes and patterns. Yacht racing, biathlon, sports shooting weapons, hyper-functional performance minimalism, objects with perfect weight distribution and ergonomics, corporate logos against translucent plastic, against carbon fiber, against perforated stretch nylon. And all through this, that original thread of what Marathon is about, that cosmically dark and mysterious vibe of a compiler floating down at the end of a hallway. And it worked. It stood out, and it raised questions. Nothing looked quite like this, much less any shooter game on the market. It felt new, and for those who did get it, it hit a nerve many didn't know existed. Because here is the fascinating thing. As we've discussed, all art is based on some amalgamation of sources. Things which cater to a highly specific niche or taste are often called original, but I think the opposite may actually be the case. So here's an example. Take 2 artists, Robert and Maxon Crumb, brothers. Both developed their styles in the 1960s, both worked with imagery that was graphic in all senses of the word in order to cope with and confront their traumatic shared childhood experiences and depraved, vulgar interests. But while R. Crumb's art has allowed viewers to connect with its confrontational nature through recognizable, familiar aesthetics, Maxon's art was weird, esoteric, a reflection of his deeply introspective, aesthetic personality. R. Crumb is one of the most famous comic artists in history, and Maxon's work, far more original than his brothers, is still almost completely unknown. I think it's very possible that the less original something is, the more recognizable its shapes, the more unique it comes across to viewers. When artists select things that audiences already connect with, when they pick and choose ideas that work, assemble them in new shapes, change their contexts, they create art that may be utterly unoriginal, but far more successful. So what did the art directors of Marathon do right? They worked with pastiche. They built an aesthetic from existing ones, from disparate sources. By putting up walls of intention, they made it clear what graphic realism was and wasn't. They inherited core franchise DNA, both visual and narrative, to create something that elevated the property into a visual style that felt nostalgic and forward-thinking, ultimately achieving something that very few can. Art that both goes against the grain and is utterly palatable, that hits for a deeper, more esoteric audience and introduces mainstream fans to something that they didn't know that they liked. Leading up to its reveal, Marathon was on top of the world. It seemed too good to fail. And even after the lackluster reveal, when many fans were somewhat disappointed with gameplay they saw, everyone agreed Marathon's art style was by far the best thing about it, enough for many to get them through the door. Where did things go wrong? And no, the answer isn't plagiarism. It goes so much farther than that. The Marathon art team drew upon a plethora of graphic design influences, going all the way back to the foundation. Ernst Keller, the father of Swiss typography, Bauhaus in the international style, classic modernism thrown against the 90s aesthetics of Ghost in the Shell, Warp Records, Evangelion, The Matrix. Games were huge influences as well, of course. The PS1 and 2 era classics, Metal Gear, Zero Divide, Deus Ex, and System Shock. The work of designers Republic on Wipeout was to many the most obvious influence, a very specific flavor of 1990s techno-futurist optimism. And somewhere in there was Anti-Real, a small independent designer whose heavy interest in typography, high contrast 2000s influenced sci-fi graphic design clearly drew upon the same interest as many in Bungie's catalog of influence, whose work was then ripped from her portfolio, altered slightly, before pieces of it were used as texture elements across Marathon itself. And this is where the snowball began, because the problem wasn't the stealing. So let's take a step back here. Why were people, to put it simply, so pissed off about this? As discussed prior, legally defined plagiarism and publicly perceived plagiarism are not one and the same, and blatantly taking another's imagery is not necessarily a sin. Anti-Real's graphic assets were used as graphic assets. Their intention, their use, by not being transformed, is thusly seen as plagiaristic. But sadly, that's only where our problems begin. Memes. The term was coined in the 70s by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins to describe a genetic marker, if you will, a unit of culture, in the same way that a gene is a unit of DNA. Memetics has declined in scholarship as a model for cultural evolution, but I've always found internet memes, a derivative concept, to be fascinatingly identical to art in how we speak through them. And no, you didn't autoplay a new video. This is still about Marathon. Internet memes, they're a joke, a standalone punchline where the setup is the world. The entirety of global cultural context a viewer may have come in contact with prior to viewing said punchline. You either get a meme the first time you see it, or you don't. And art, it works the same way. Everything is based on that which precedes it. One would be foolish to try and seek the true origin of an idea. Everything is a copy upon a copy, each subsequent idea adapting to its current context, eventually residing across the collective in waves. Artists are truly great when they create something less original but more unique by effectively grasping existing ideas, warping them through their own highly specific personal and esoteric life experiences to create something which others, on one hand, get by speaking the same artistic language as their audience, but which also specifically carries their unique tone of voice, something specific and personal to them. When you like something, you share something special with those who like the same thing. When artists on a team are in a scene, when they're cut from the same block, if you will, when they speak the language, they can iterate on it effectively. See, while this may not remotely be the most egregious case of plagiarism I've seen in a game, here's why it's by far the most frustrating. As soon as I had gotten my hands on the actual game Marathon, I was faced with increasing aesthetic inconsistencies. Places where the art direction was just immaculate, everything that good game art should be, immersive, iconic, derivative in the right places, and incredibly, shockingly, breathtakingly new and strange in others. And there were these other elements, largely decals, choice in typeface and symbology, UI. They felt like someone found something that just fit the vibe kinda well enough, dropped it in, and went, yeah, that looks good enough, ship it. And knowing that this is exactly what happened, it explains so much. Because Anti-Real's art, adjacent, sure, but it wasn't Marathon's style. This whole situation, It proved a reality that I really hadn't wanted to believe myself, that we are no longer in the era of scenes, of subcultures derived from shared experience and artistic understanding. We live in the Pinterest era, the era of trends. Scenes, subcultures, they don't exist in the way that they once did. The sources for pastiche are not shared cultural or geographic context, they're the entire internet, sorted into mood boards and color scheme vibe. I'm guilty of this myself. In gathering imagery for this video, I used search engines. I found things that popped up first. The best artists, they iterate with intention. They can create classics, icons from pastiche, homage, and appropriation. By speaking the right language, in many cases, the copy can become more well-known and influential than the thing that it copied. But at big AAA studios, well, especially on large teams, wires get crossed, and artists, way more often than you realize, are given orders from higher-ups to create something identical to an existing thing. The artist then needs to tick that box for their boss, or, well, get fired. Sometimes, again, when you really know what you're doing, this works out fine. You make a copy, you iterate on it, and add this or that flavor to create something that's your own. But when circumstances are unhealthy and contradictory, when goals have been changed and changed back and changed again, when an artist is rushed, they may feel backed into a corner. If said artist doesn't have that raw understanding or correct visual literacy to instantly, creatively, and effectively iterate, when deadlines and corporate bullet points trump the defining walls of tonal specificity and that closely knit shared understanding is lost, well, they may just fail to iterate, they'll do the bare minimum, make a direct copy, and their art will suffer as a result. Or they may resort to stealing outright. Blatant plagiarism, utterly non-transformative. And as we mentioned before, it really doesn't matter in public perception which one was the case. And that's why this situation cuts so deep. In AAA FPS games, the kind of games that I tend to play for some reason, art which hits personally, which speaks a dialect and tone rarely heard above the monotony, it's exceedingly rare. What hurts so much is how close they got, how intelligent some of these decisions are. The work of pastiche is truly breathtaking in how specific it is. It's a style that's unmistakably brilliant, that anyone can agree has incredible potential. The Mielgo-directed short on its own proves this. And with graphic design at its core, the graphic design needed not just be good, it needed more than ever to be its own. But with the graphic design compromised in public perception, roles were reversed. The art style, the thing that many claimed was the game's best feature, its saving grace, was now a poison seed at the heart of the project, a perfectly placed catalyst for denigration and reduction of anything once perceived as good. I get absolutely no joy from discussing how this went down, because in a situation like this, everyone loses. The artist who plagiarizes loses their unique voice, that light of personal soul and circumstance that shine through to allow others to hear them through their art. They commit the worst sin in art making of all, not of losing their job or getting replaced by AI. Worse, they become AI. A machine for ticking boxes, filling things in just enough so that every audience will sort of like some aspect of the result. The person who was plagiarized from loses, of course. They lose paid work, but maybe more importantly, they lose their identity. That ownership of their ideas as something personal, their self-value and merit as part of the art conversation are reduced to a talking point. They are now that artist who got their stuff stolen. We lose the right to engage and connect with work for what it says about its creators and what we share with them thusly. We lose the chance for new ideas to breed new movements, for new classics to be forged. We lose what makes art art. The company loses their reputation, connection to audiences as people rather than points on a quarterly report. They lose the patience and human connection of an audience that wants to see them succeed. And yeah, somebody's gonna lose their job. Not the people at the top, the ones perpetuating this self-fulfilling cycle, but an artist, someone who probably spent their life's work trying to get into this position in the first place. Artists, we copy, we steal. It's not only fundamental to the process of art making, it's literally impossible not to do. Everything is derivative. And if you're an artist, if you're any good, you will be stolen from. And part of supporting artists, not just for snappy headlines or a hit tweet, but actually supporting what art is about, the diverse and inexplicable non-verbal conversations we have with others through it. It requires that stealing of art is protected, actually that it thrives. But it needs to happen with purpose, in the right way. I see this not just as a creative or an artist myself, if you want to call me that, but as a lover of art. Restricting the ability for people to copy and steal things won't protect artists. It'll just ensure a world with more slop, less personal raw creativity, and an entertainment space that is just goddamn boring. I want to see iteration on the things that I love, in the subjects I enjoy, with textures and shapes and colors that I want to see more of, see done differently than I could imagine. So, if you're an artist, own that thing that's yours. Communicate your intentions and inspirations honestly and loudly. Make your art a platform for those who share your taste. Know your history better than your peers. Master your medium better than others. Support people whose art you love and buy things you think are cool. If you work at a studio, build teams you can trust to carry through on a vision that tells a story that's unmistakably its own. Because a good story, you know what? It sells well. And if you're in a leadership position, to identify an artist whose work fits in your project, just fucking hire them. It might be the last chance that you get to do so.